Happy Halloween, everybody. I hope you guys have a great time this weekend, and because this is the last video in October for me, I wanted to do another one of these remake videos because it's just been too long.
Revenge of the Remakes.
The Omen. And The Omen is one of those movie franchises where I'm not really sure how to classify it. It's horror, definitely, but it's not really a slasher. It's not really supernatural, even though there are supernatural elements. It's actually more of an investigation type movie and mystery. And for the sake of this video, I'm going to be talking about the 1976 original directed by Richard Donner, along with the 2006 remake directed by John Moore. And just to make it easier on myself, I'm not going to be counting any of the Omen sequels because, for one, I don't think it's fair because the remake only has the one movie. And on top of that, I haven't seen all of them, so it's not really fair to judge something based on something I haven't seen yet. So that's enough disclaimers. Let's talk about what I actually think. So I actually kind of love The Omen. As a Christian, I know that this story is nowhere near an accurate representation of what the Bible says the Antichrist is supposed to be like and how he's supposed to come into the world and all that. But even knowing that, it still doesn't hamper my enjoyment of both of these movies because the idea is such an interesting one. What would the Antichrist as a small child be like? What would it be like trying to raise this thing? And as we find out over the course of both of these movies, it is no easy task. And revisiting these movies, it's remarkable to me how similar they actually are. Now, it's not a shot-for-shot remake like they did with Psycho, which was just a dumb idea, but the plots and sequence of events with these two movies is probably the closest that I've ever reviewed on this channel. And it actually put me in a bit of a spot because they are so similar. There's not that much to talk about because it's just, you're watching it again, but with slightly different actors in a slightly different time period. And I guess I'll start with our main character, and that's Robert Thorne. In the original, he's played by Gregory Peck, and in the remake, he's played by Liev Schreiber. If you were to tell me that the adopted father of the Antichrist was either going to be Ahab or Sabretooth, yeah, that sounds about right. I believe you. And Thorne is eagerly awaiting the birth of his son, but then there's some complications that happen and they ended up losing the baby. Nobody really knows what went wrong, but it might have something to do with the fact that it's June 6th at 6 a.m. But then the priest there says that there is still hope if you really want a child, if you don't want to break the wife's heart. We have a newborn baby whose mother just died during childbirth. It'd be almost as if nothing went wrong. And so he agrees to this, and now they have a kid, and they name him Damien. Because if pop culture has taught us anything, it's that naming a child Damien will just lead to all kinds of problems. And it's around here where the time period difference from the 70s to the early 2000s really starts to show, because they both have this kind of montage sequence where you see Damien go from being a newborn to being 5. And in the original, it's done with photos because back then everybody was taking photos. But in 2006, we have home video. So instead of just a bunch of pictures like a slideshow that were being shown, we're actually seeing home movies. And there is an opportunity for a bit more character development in the video version where you see Damien and the mom, who, by the way, is played by Lee Remick in the original and Julia Stiles in the remake. And in the original, when the photo montage ends, we're placed right at Damien's 5-year-old birthday party. And that's really where the movie gets going, but the remake actually takes its time a little bit more getting to that birthday party because we have a couple scenes that happen to set things up. The first scene I forgot to mention happens in the very beginning where you see this council of priests in Rome in the Vatican, and they're talking about the end of the world, and one of the priests is giving a presentation on all these signs, the Twin Towers falling down, there's a comet, there's hurricanes and earthquakes and all these natural disasters that seem to paint a picture of us getting closer to the end times. So that's pretty interesting, and it does reinforce the idea that the Antichrist could have already been born and we just didn't know it, because both of these movies are very contemporary movies. You can definitely tell what decade they were made in just by looking at it. And I think that's the point. I think that's why this movie, without many changes being made, has been able to make that generational leap. Because it'll always be interesting to imagine, what if the Antichrist has already been born and we just don't know yet? But the second scene that the remake added is a death scene involving Liev Schreiber's boss, who's this ambassador, that now that he's dead, Liev Schreiber becomes the ambassador to England, and that's how he gets the job. In the original, it's more just things happened that way and he just got reassigned, so that's how that happened. But in the remake, when you see the death of his boss and that's how he gets promoted and that's how things get set in motion, you get more of a sense that there are demonic forces at play. And I really do like the scene because while it's not super graphic like we'll get to in some of the later deaths, it has that chain reaction Final Destination feel to it, where you're like, okay, what are the odds that this happened that led to this, that led to this, that led to this, that led to the car blowing up. And when I imagine how the devil would set up circumstances to allow the Antichrist to run to power, I would think it would happen pretty similar to this, where no one would really question it. It wouldn't call attention to itself. It'd just be, oh, there was an accident, there's a job opening, put 2 and 2 together, there you go. But now we get to the birthday party, and this is one of the most famous scenes in the Omen ever. And it's actually the scene that got me interested in the Omen in the first place, because I didn't watch a lot of horror movies as a kid, but my dad would constantly reference or tell me stories of horror movies that he saw that left an impression, and of course that would make me really want to see the movie. And The Omen was one of those, and he told me that there was this scene at a birthday party where the nanny gets a message saying that she needs to hang herself for the betterment of Damien, and so she jumps off of the roof of a 4-story mansion and dies. It's maybe not the kind of story that you would advise telling an 8-ish-year-old kid, but it got my attention and I really wanted to see the movie after that, and when I finally saw it, it didn't disappoint. This is a shocking and uncomfortable scene. I think I figured it out. It's a combination of the happiness of the birthday party and just the unassummingness of everything, where you think, oh, everything's fine, nothing could go wrong, and then all of a sudden you look up and you see the nanny standing on the roof with a noose around her neck, and you're like, uh-oh, this isn't gonna go well. And if that wasn't enough, the way she says, Damien, it's all for you, in that sweet, nurturing voice, it just sends shivers down my spine. It's so creepy and perfect for this surreal situation we find ourselves in. But I think what really sells it is the fact that she does jump and she does die, and it's shot very similar in both versions, so there's not much to compare here. But what sells it is the reactions of all the kids and the parents that are trying to hide the kids' faces so they're not traumatized by this dangling nanny. And as if Robert Thorne wasn't going through enough at the moment, the next day he gets a visit from Father Brennan. In the original, he's played by Patrick Troughton, and in the remake, he's played by Pete Postlethwaite. And while, like all the other castings, they're very similar, and the remake does a great job at capturing a lot of the energy of the original. But with these two, I do think I like Postlethwaite's interpretation better, because he just brings a little more humanity to the role. In the original, he's very creepy and unsettling and aggressive, and I think it's his eyes. There's something about Troughton's eyes that are just so intense, and the cinematography in the original is very eye-centric. There's a lot of close-ups or pushing in on eyes to really get these emotions and expressions, and for the most part it's very effective. But with Father Brennan, you get more of a sense that he's an antagonist rather than an ally. And to be fair, the movie does still use him as an ally, but he carries himself in such a way and he's so aggressive towards Thorne that you really do feel an antagonism there. But in the remake, Postlethwaite, while he's still kind of creepy and unsettling, there is a genuine earnestness to what he wants to do. He wants to save himself, he wants to save Thorne and his family, and he just wants all this to be resolved as quickly and with as little death as possible. But he knows that the clock and prophecy are both against him, so there's desperation there. And I just think Postlethwaite does a better job for what that's worth. But he comes in and has a bit of a meeting with Thorne that doesn't go all that well, because he's just preaching at him. He's not really giving him a lot of information. And Thorne in both versions is not an overly religious man. He's pretty atheistic, or at least agnostic. And a big part of both movies is getting Thorne to accept that his child is not his child or even human, but the son of the devil. And to have a character that's so far removed from religion, that doesn't really have a faith, is really interesting, because what does it take for someone to actually believe this enough where they will kill their son? But at this stage, at least, he's not convinced, so he throws Father Brennan out. He doesn't want to hear any of it, and he goes home, and him and his wife have a couple scenes together. And this is another difference in these movies. In the original, it's very clear that Robert and Kathy love each other, that they have a good, stable marriage, that they care deeply for one another, and it's really quite sweet in a lot of scenes. But in the remake, while it's still clear that they do love each other and they are married and they are happy, there is a bit more tension in the marriage where they do argue and they aren't always on the same page, and sometimes their personalities make it difficult to communicate. So in that way, it does feel a bit more honest in its depiction of this marriage, because especially if you're in politics, if you're an ambassador, you're not going to be home a lot, so there's going to be tension. But that's enough of that, because we've got Mrs. Baylock to introduce. I'm not really sure what she is. She's basically the same in both versions, so you can kind of pick your poison with her. But in my mind, I always just think of her as a witch, and while she's definitely an agent of state, and it's still kind of vague on whether or not she actually is a witch technically, or just a zealous Satanist woman, because she is definitely that, and she is very eager to start getting to know Damien with or without the parents' consent, and even going so far as to behind their back install a guard dog for Damien's protection. And this brings me to something I really wish the remake did, because it had an opportunity to do something that the original couldn't because of budget and filming locations and production restraints. And it's that all the dogs that are in this film, and there are a few of them, there's one that I forgot to mention at a birthday party that looks at the nanny and convinces her to go hang herself. But then later in the movie they show up a third time. And I'm jumping around a little bit here, but my problem is that it's established that Damien's birth mother was a jackal. And for those of you who don't know, a jackal looks like this. And in the original script, all the dogs that would be on screen were supposed to be German Shepherds. They look like this. So, you know, close enough to a jackal without having to wrangle actual jackals. And I could see your average audience member just associating German Shepherds with jackals is close enough. It'll work. But that's not what we see in the movie. In the movie, they got Rottweilers that look absolutely nothing like jackals. They don't look like German Shepherds. They just look like big angry dogs. And I get why they had to do that. They were shooting in England. They couldn't get German Shepherds. Okay, it's not super distracting, and you kind of buy the idea that, oh, these are hellhounds. You know, they're not jackals, but they're still demonic dogs, and they listen to Damien and whatever. It works enough. But in the remake, they really had an opportunity to deliver. And they do with the first scene, the scene at the birthday party, where you do see a German Shepherd, a black one, so you know it's kind of a demonic German Shepherd and jackal-like. So I'm like, okay, they're doing it. But then when the guard dog shows up and the dog's towards the end of the movie, it's all Rottweilers again. So what was the point of doing a German Shepherd just for that one scene? Why not go all the way with it? I kept waiting for the German Shepherds to show up, and they never did. So that's just disappointing, because it was such a clear opportunity to do something better than the original, and they just opted not to. This is where things really get going, because now Damien is starting to exhibit more of his demonic tendencies, and maybe it's because of the presence of Mrs. Baylock. Maybe it's just that he's getting a little older, a little bolder. He's already killed once, so there's nothing holding him back now. And the next instance of this in both versions is when he goes to the zoo and he freaks out a bunch of animals. So now the mom is paranoid, because what is Damien? Why are the animals reacting to him in such a violent way? And is he even my kid? He's really going through a lot in this movie. And I do appreciate that both actors are really trying to bring a level of pathos to what it would be like if you were the mother of the Antichrist, and that feeling that the child isn't yours, and what could it be, and is it something evil? And I will say the original, I think, does it more subtly in a more natural way, because getting that across is entirely dependent on Lee Remick's performance. There's nothing else really helping her. But in the remake, Julia Stiles is helped with these weird, symbolic dream sequences with a lot of just strange, grotesque imagery thrown at you really fast. And at first I kind of liked this, because that WTF imagery makes it feel more evil, more demonic, that she's kind of being tormented by these spirits or the devil itself. But after thinking about it a while, the dreams don't really add much that we don't already get with the original and Lee Remick's performance. So at the end of the day, the dreams are kind of interesting, and there are some things you can look into with the imagery on display, but it doesn't really add up to a lot, and it's honestly more distracting from the overall narrative than anything else. But one thing we do learn in this section is that she's pregnant again. She's gonna have another baby, and she's not too thrilled about that, because she's not too thrilled about her current kid. She thinks her current kid's evil and not hers. She's going to see a psychologist about it, but that doesn't really seem to be helping, and having a baby right now probably isn't the best thing for her mentally. So she is seriously considering an abortion, which Robert really isn't that keen on, because just before she told him about this baby, he met with Father Brennan again, and he told him that your wife is pregnant and is in mortal danger, because if they do have legitimate kids, then Damien doesn't really get the inheritance, so that's a problem. So where Robert's at right now is that, okay, if this baby lives, well then it proves Father Brennan wrong, and maybe he's just wrong about everything and we could just go back to having a normal life. But in true horror movie fashion, it doesn't really go that way. And we get 2 deaths pretty quickly back to back. The first one is Father Brennan. Right after he meets with Robert, he's caught in this big storm. He's trying to get into this church for safety and sanctuary, but it's locked. So before he can find a way inside, the top of the church gets struck by lightning and this big spire gets loose and it just falls on him and impales him to the ground. And I have to say that The Omen has some of the most memorable deaths of any horror franchise. And it's really just 3 kills. Now, more than 3 people die in this movie, but there are 3 super memorable, visually interesting kills. The first of which is the nanny at the birthday party, and the second is this priest. Just the image of him being impaled the way he was, stuck on the church lawn, that will stick with you. And I do have to give some extra credit to the remake because it did go the extra mile. When the spire was coming down at him, they actually had it where it went through a stained glass window. So not only was he impaled, but there was actual shards of stained glass all over his face when he was looking up at it. But the next death is the unfortunate death of the baby in Kate's womb. And this happens in a scene where Kate's standing on a chair doing some cleaning and Damien comes running around a corner and knocks her over the balcony and she kind of splats on the ground floor. She falls a story, maybe a story and a half. She gets whisked to the hospital. They aren't able to save the baby. It's really sad. Thorne is not really processing this well because it means that Father Brennan was right, and if he's right about this, maybe he's right about other things. And before he can really come to grips with that, he gets a phone call from this photographer, Jennings. And in the original, he's played by David Warner, and in the remake, he's played by David Thewlis. And both actors do a very good job at bringing Jennings to life. They're both legendary British actors, and when I see David Thewlis in this movie, it's almost like he's the reincarnated younger version of David Warner. They are just so equal to each other. I can't pick a favorite. But Jen calls him up and says he's got some photos and some questions for him and possibly an explanation about Father Brennan and all the weird things that have been happening. Because while Jennings hasn't been a main player in this story, he has popped up here and there. He was at the birthday party. He's been taking photographs from a distance. He's been kind of stalking Thorne and the people that have been around him. And when Thorne visits his apartment, he shows him all these photographs. And in the photographs, you can see literal foreshadowings on the film of the way that the nanny and the priest died. With the nanny, you see this shadowy line coming from the top of the film straight down and then curving around her neck, implying the rope. And with the priest, you see this tapered line going right towards his heart, and in each subsequent photo, it gets darker and more pronounced and closer to the skin. But most importantly, narratively, this is a great device. I love this idea of photographs hinting at the way you're gonna die, and I think it's the 3rd or 4th Final Destination movie that kind of did this, with the roller coaster where you see little clues about how they're going to die in the photographs. And I guarantee you the writer of that movie was inspired by The Omen because this is such a unique device to hint at future deaths. And from here to pretty much the end of the movie, Jennings and Robert Thorne are investigating all the leads that have been hinted at before, from Father Brennan's diary and the information that he's given Thorne. They go to Rome, they go to Megiddo, constantly looking for clues that could lead them to answers about the Antichrist. And along the way, they do get to a cemetery where they find the grave of Damien's mother and Thorne's child, the child that died. And this is one of the more impactful scenes in the movie because they pry open these graves. And first you see the mom, and the mom is a jackal. It's a dog skeleton. It's really gross and unsettling. But I think what's more impactful is to reveal the child, because it's not just that the child is there and it's this little kid skeleton, but it's that it's got a hole in the head. And both versions do the same thing here. You see that there's this little hole in the child's head, implying that the child did not die of natural causes, that somebody at the hospital had actually murdered the baby so that they could do this swap to put Damien in a position of power later on. And this is a heartbreaking scene to watch in any version because you see that and your heart just goes out for Robert, and he's not taking it well. He's breaking down. And this is where I'm pretty sure there is some kind of Mandela effect thing going on, because I could have sworn that one of these versions had it where the jackal and the child were in the same grave together, but that's not how either version plays out. Both versions have it where there's a mother's grave and a child's grave, and they're separate. So maybe I'm just remembering it wrong, but comment below if you remember there being one grave in one of the versions. But going back to Robert and his suffering, he doesn't really have time to grieve this, and this is a through line through most of the movie. He doesn't really have time to grieve ever because things just keep happening and he has to keep moving forward because it's just disaster after disaster and bad news after bad news. And this time the bad news is a bunch of hellhounds that are guarding this cemetery, and they're not thrilled that these two people are messing up their graves, so they're going to try to run them out of there or kill them or whatever. And again, this is where the Rottweilers come back. But I guess it's time for another death scene because Katie is in the hospital and she's recovering from her fall, but then Mrs. Baylock comes in with Damien and she kills her. And this is probably one of the biggest departures between versions, because in the original she shows up, she goes into the room and she just pushes her out of a window and she falls on top of this ambulance. I guess I wouldn't really fly in 2006 because security is a lot tighter, and if she were to pull that, she'd definitely get caught. So she manages to kill her in a bit more creative way. She takes out a syringe, fills it with air, and she injects it into her blood transfusion tube or IV or whatever. It creates this bubble where when it reaches her, she dies. So she dies in a very untraceable way that actually makes sense why Mrs. Baylock could just walk out of the hospital and no one would suspect anything until it's too late. But now we come to what is the best death scene in the movie. It's my favorite, and it's the death of Jennings. So Jennings' death comes at an interesting point. They're in the Middle East now. They've gotten these ritual knives that he's supposed to use in sequence to kill the physical and spiritual life of Damien, otherwise it won't work. But it's here where Robert is holding these knives and he's not sure anymore if he can actually go through with this. He's gonna kill his son. This is not a small feat. So Robert throws these knives away. He's not gonna do it, and Jennings like, listen, I'm gonna die soon. I'm marked for death. I have a photograph of myself and my head is being severed by some kind of ghostly image. So I don't want this to happen to me, so we gotta kill Damien. So it's while he's gathering up these knives is when his death occurs, and both happen in very Final Destination chain reaction kind of ways. In the original, it's a truck with loose brakes that starts rolling down a hill, and it's got sheets of glass in the back, and when it stops, the sheets keep going and it just decapitates him, and you see the head go flying, and you see the head and the body, and it freaks out Thorne, and he's like, okay, prophecy and all that, I guess I'll do it. But in the remake, they do it slightly differently, where there's a bunch of workmen on the roof of a building that he's right next to, and a hammer falls and it hits this sign, this big metal sign that gets loosened, and it swings down and it just cuts the head right off. Head goes flying in almost an identical effect. I would say that's an equal visualization of the decapitation. If it wasn't for the out of nowhere and very intense shaky cam that happens on Thorne's reaction to this, and it's just kind of a little too much for me. I think his expression and acting was enough. I don't think you needed that really gimmicky directorial trope to sell the trauma. But suffice it to say, Thorne is now convinced that Damien needs to die. And now he's just had enough, so he goes back to the house and he snips off some of his hair to truly reveal the 666 mark of the beast. So now he knows, okay, you are the devil's child, and he scoops him up. He fights off Baylock and she dies. In the remake, it's actually kind of funny because he just hits her with his car and she goes flying over the hood. I don't think it was meant to be comedic, but I always take it as comedic because I just think the slapstick of it is too funny not to laugh at. But in both versions, he takes Damien into the church, and Damien's screaming and trying to fight him and just panicking all around, and he raises the knife, is about to kill Damien, but the police show up and they shoot Thorne before he can drop the knife. And this is where I think the original really does do that better, because it's just one shot of the gun and it's a pistol. In the remake, they got this like SWAT team coming in to try to kill him, and they got laser sights, and I just think it's a little overplayed for what the scene demands. In the original, it's just a bunch of cops that were probably going to pull him over for a speeding violation, but now they see him with the child and the knife, so one of them pulls out a gun and shoots one bullet, and it's slow-mo and it's smoky, and it's actually kind of hard to see exactly what happened until it dissolves to the aftermath, and you see this military-style funeral, and you can imply that it's a double funeral for Mr. and Mrs. Thorne, because you see the president, you don't see his face, you just see the back of his head, and then it tilts down to Damien holding the president's hand. So now Damien has moved up in the world. Instead of being adopted by an ambassador, he's now adopted by the president. And it's on this very ominous ending where both movies leave us, and I can't tell you how much I enjoy both of these movies. It's so hard to really pick a favorite because they're so similar and they do a lot of the same things right, but they also do some things like the dog situation both about equally wrong. But I guess at the end of the day, which one would I recommend more? I think I would actually recommend the remake in this situation because it is closer to the modern day. The imminent threat of the Antichrist does feel a bit more urgent because they are using stuff like 9/11 and hurricanes and earthquakes and natural disasters that are more recent, and people are constantly worried about those kinds of things more so than just the vague idea of the Antichrist being born in the present day. And the 70s, they were quite some time ago, so watching that one, it does feel a bit more detached from reality compared to the remake. It's very close, but just marginally I think I would recommend the Omen remake. For nothing else, if you haven't seen it before, give it a watch. I'd say watch both regardless. I would recommend the remake if you've only got time to watch one or the other. I'd give the remake a shot, but the original, such a classic, one of Richard Donner's best movies. The score is amazing, so I'd say watch both, but if you're in a pinch, give the remake a watch. It might be worth your while. But now I turn it over to you guys. What do you think about the Omen? Which one's your favorite? Whatever you think, let me know in the comments. And if you like this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more content and hit the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a video. As always, I'm Colby. This is my nerdy talk. And I'll see you in the next video.